Okay, so thanks for having me along even though it's remotely. My name is Robert Crane, for those of you who don't know. I am an Office 365 MVP. I work in my own business out of Sydney, Australia, and that business is the CIA Ops. So you can find out more about me by visiting that location on the internet. Now, what I want to cover basically is we do some introduction on Azure, but before that let's do some housekeeping. So if you do have any questions, probably the best way is to just either use Twitter to get me directly or use the hashtag #CIAOps. I'll also keep an eye on my emails in case there are any questions. But with that, so let's get started. So what I ask a lot of people, especially resellers these days, is what do they think Azure is? So there's a lot of confusion as to what Azure actually is in the market these days. And again, this is probably the easiest answer to this is to basically say it's your on-demand data center. So if you have the requirement to host customers' websites, if you have the need to host customers' SQL databases, virtual machines, Azure can certainly do that. Azure can also be scaled out to do things like machine learning, Active Directory identities, traffic manager. So there's a whole lot of resources that are available through Azure. So don't just think it's hosting virtual machines or SQL servers. It's doing a huge amount more than that. So basically some quotes, and again this was inspired I suppose a bit by Michael's information that I saw. So Azure in 2014 has surpassed the 1 billion annual revenue. Subscriptions are growing at basically almost 100% per annum. In 2010, there's been over 200 billion authentications through Windows Azure AD, and in 2012 there was 4.7 billion per week. 4 trillion objects back in 2012, 2,700 average requests per second. Again, these are relatively old figures. And again, back in 2012 there were 50 million active users. Now, the big figure that I suppose woke me up was the fact that of all the Azure business, only about 1/3 is done through partners. So customers are now finding Azure and using it themselves, and obviously creating a lot of problems for themselves, which I think creates a lot of opportunity for resellers. So the agenda that we'll cover today is basically I'll give you a bit of a background as to why I got into Azure myself. We'll look at a bit of what Azure is, do a demo, and I'll talk about some what I think is coming down the future. So my own journey is I'm a SharePoint guy. I need to convert typically customers' databases from Company Web 2003 into SharePoint 2013 to allow me to go to Office 365. Now the way that I had been doing that is I've basically installed VirtualBox on an 8 GB laptop with 2 TB of hard drive that I would cart around with me to make it easier to work on and access client information. But unfortunately that laptop is beginning to run a bit slow, it's overheating, and I can see that it's eventually going to die. So what I need to do in essence is I need to do a number of different steps. So one of these steps is taking Company Web from SBS 2003 and basically converting it into Windows SharePoint Services version 3. To achieve that I need a virtual machine running SharePoint version 3 plus the embedded version of SQL. Now that's fine, I can fit all that on a single VM, relatively small memory size and footprint. Now if I go to, then I have to, now the way SharePoint works is you have to swing through each version. You can't go straight from version 2 to 2013. You have to go from version 2 to version 3 to 2010 to 2013. So I need all of these machines. Now to go from version 3 to 2010, I need to have another server with Windows SharePoint Foundation 2010 on that, and it also now has SQL Express. But one of the requirements for 2010 is to actually have a domain controller. So if I need to run a 2010 Foundation server, I need a domain controller. Now, after a bit of research, it turns out that if I get smart with PowerShell, then what I can do is remove the need for the DC. So again, I just need a single machine running SQL. Now, if I want to make the jump from 2010 to 2013, it's much the same story. I need SQL Express 2008 and Foundation Services 2013. But this time, I need a DC. There's no way I can use a PowerShell script to remove the requirement for a DC in this conversion environment. So if we have a look at what I need to do from customers who have SBS 2003 Company Web all the way up to Office 365, I need to basically step them through each one of these virtual environments. So I need basically to have at a minimum 4 virtual servers to be able to swing the databases through to do this. Now, what I could do is obviously go out and buy a new laptop, but then, okay, what happens if I have an environment that has Office Web Apps on it or need Office Web Apps? Okay, so again, that's another mix we're seeing. What happens when I get databases bigger than 10 gigs? So SQL Express is limited, R2 is limited to 10 gigabytes. So if I need a full version of SQL on the box, that's more memory, more processing power than I may need. What happens if I need to convert SharePoint server conversions as well? Rather than Foundation, when I need to do server conversions, again, I may need more grunt. So in that case, it looks as though I'm going to need a machine with at least 16 gig of RAM and big disks and all that. So that's when I began to question as to whether I need actually to do that. So that's when I started to explore Azure. So Azure can provide me with virtual machines. So all those virtual machines, the Windows SharePoint services, the 2010, the 2013, the domain controller, it can do all that for me. But it can also provide things like websites. So I could run a WordPress website on Azure. Okay, it also allows me to do mobile services. So if I want to get into writing the next Flappy Birds and make my living that way, I can look at getting into mobile services. It also allows me to host SQL databases. So without the need to run up a virtual machine and install SQL on it, I can basically take advantage of the Azure SQL service, the platform as a service directly. One of the major points now is becoming the Active Directory. So I can now access the Azure Active Directory. So if you're not aware, every Office 365 tenant, the users, the identities are managed through Azure. You can log into Azure with an Office 365 Global admin, and you can potentially access the Active Directory for that Office 365 tenant. And that opens a number of options, which hopefully I'll be able to show you. You've also got the ability in Azure to do recovery services. So what you can do is you can use Azure Backup. So you can put an agent on a Windows server, and you can do a file-based backup into an encrypted vault within Azure. You can also use Azure to do Hyper-V replicas. Okay, a bit more involved, a bit more in knowledge and requirement, but you can certainly do Hyper-V replicas directly to Azure. We've also got the ability in Azure to create networks. So we can network virtual machines together, we can network all these different devices, and we can control them as we would on-premise. So we get a full virtual network we can actually extend into our local network as well via things like point-to-site and site-to-site VPNs. Now, one of the biggest opportunities that I'm keen on is machine learning. So a machine learning allows you to craft an algorithm that, for example, could pull data, public data from the weather service, the airline timetables, passenger numbers, all that sort of stuff, and come down and work out whether there's a chance of your flight being late. So all of this Internet of Things, all this data that's being streamed could be consumed by something like Azure, and then machine learning could be run over the top of it to give you trends. So where machine learning becomes very important is if you think about things like Facebook and social and liking and things getting auto-ranking, that's machine learning happening in the background. We've also got the option here for Traffic Manager. So Traffic Manager allows me to do complex DNS routing, so I can do round-robin DNSing. I can move my DNS and requests between geolocation, so I can move web server requests from the US in the morning over to Australia here when the sun shines to keep the traffic, obviously, and the response quick. The other one which has just gone general release is Remote App. So what I can do is I can actually publish my application into its own AppV style RDS server, and means I can do things like running applications such as Visio, PowerShell, and the DOS prompt on any device. So on the iPad with Remote App, for example, I can run Visio, I can run PowerShell, and I can run a DOS prompt. So this is what Remote App is giving me. So again, it's a bit like providing an RDS server without having to go through all the drama of running up an RDS box. Now obviously it does a hell of a lot more than that, and again we can only cover a short amount of stuff. So what I'll do here is let me just switch across to the demo. So okay, so what we've got here is you'll see that I have, this is my partner Azure tenant. So if you're a partner who has ActionPack at a minimum, you will have at least $100 worth of credits to use Azure every month. So you get $100 worth of credits. Now, the Azure items here are over on the left. So we've got websites, virtual machines. So if you have a look at virtual machines, what you'll see here is I have, for example, my domain controller, I have an RDS box, I have SharePoint 2010, 2013, SQL Server, and a number of workstations. Now I'm running one of the workstations now, which happens to be a Windows 8 machine, and we'll come to that. You'll see that I've got mobile services, I've got to have an SQL database, so this is just a hosted SQL database without having to worry about running up a server. I've got things like Hadoop Insight, I've got media services, I can actually run Visual Studio potentially, BizTalk servers, and again, in my recovery services, you'll notice that I have a number of backup vaults into which I can send data from servers. Now, right down the bottom here, what you'll find is we have an Active Directory. Okay, so I can, again, control an Active Directory. Azure on its own standalone has its own Active Directory, but where we see some real interest is when you access the Office 365 AD, which I'll come to. Now what I'll do is just quickly throw across, this is a demo Azure tenant, so you can sign up for a demo Azure tenant at any time. You'll get about $200 worth of credits to play with. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to run up a new machine. So what I've got here is I already have basically a Windows server running, so I'm just going to start that so I can come back to that. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new web server. So what I do is I go New, and then I select Virtual Machine, and I'll select from the gallery. Now, what I've got here is I have a list of machine images that I can now base my new virtual machine on. Now, if I scroll through that, you'll see that I get SQL servers, I've got BizTalk servers, I've got Oracle servers. In my case, I have Visual Studio, I've got Linux options, I have Riverbed, and I've also got, for example, the option to run up some firewall, so I can run up a Barracuda. You'll notice that I also have the option down here to create my own images, so you can create a virtual machine, sysprep it, and then save it into Azure for later use. But in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Server R2 Data Center and go Next. What I'm then going to do here is give the web server a name, so this is going to be Web Server 2. I can pick from a tier, so basically the tiers allow different performance criteria. So in this case I'm on the standard tier, and you'll see here that I can now choose from the different powers of the machine. So the A machines basically are running SCSI disks, where the D machines are running SSDs, right? So if I select an A3, for example, I've got to put in a username. So this is the user that is going to log into the server via RDP client. So let me just concentrate on putting the right password in twice. Okay, so once I've got that, I then go across. Now, when I create a virtual machine, I need to put it in a cloud service. So think of a cloud service like a container in which you can put different resources. I'm going to create a new cloud service. When I do, that cloud service will be available directly on the internet. Okay, so it will be available via CBB, in this case web2.cloudapp.net. So what I can then do is select actually what's called the affinity or the region. So you'll see that I can locate it all the way over in your neck of the woods, or I can now locate it all the way over here. So in this case, I put it in the Australian East Data Centre. I'm going to automatically generate an account to put the disks in, so the storage, the actual disks that this will run on. And in this case, what I'm going to do down here is I want this to be a web server. So I'm going to go down, for example, and add the HTTP service, okay, so as my endpoint. So now it's going to map not only RDP, not only PowerShell, but also basically port 80 from the outside Azure directly to the machine. So with that done, I then can choose from a number of agents. I just normally leave the standard, and basically then off it goes. So what it's going to do now is it will start spinning up that machine, it will start creating it, and will come back and let me know when that's ready to go. So depending on the image, that can take 5 or so minutes. So again, hopefully this web server will spin up quickly. Once I've connected, once that's up and running, I can RDP into it. I would then install IIS on it, and because the port has been forwarded through port 80, I can now basically go into that server. So my web server 1 is currently running here. So what I'll do is I will RDP into that, and that will just happen on another screen over here. Okay, so I just need to get the login correctly. And what you'll see is when it actually RDPs to me, I will then that will then allow me to access that server directly. So are there any questions while I'm concentrating on logging in at the moment?
Can you hear me from here, or should I walk closer?
No, I can hear you.
Okay. Maybe later in your presentation, but can you give us an idea of how we would estimate costs on some of these things?
Yep, I can give you a pricing. Yep, I can give you the pricing calculator. The challenge with this is that the pricing model is very different in the fact that it is basically a per month, a per minute charge. Okay, so it can be very hard to estimate exactly what the costs are, but I can run over. There are 2 ways to do it. You can use the public pricing calculator, or you can use a partner spreadsheet that will work it out for you. So let me just...
I'm just thinking, if I were going to recommend this to a client, moving them off of their in-house file server into this, for example, I got to be able to give them some sort of understanding that it'll be different each month, but some sort of ballpark as to where they can expect it to be.
You can certainly give them you can certainly give them a ballpark, but it's very hard to, for example, say, look, it's going to cost you $40 a month. That sort of figure is very hard to estimate, and a lot of it is based on the demand that's used. So that, again, it is a little bit hard. I'll show you the pricing calculator, but it's a bit of a change of thinking here in the model. So for some reason, I can't get to that server, but I'll leave that run up. I've forgotten the password, unfortunately, so we'll leave this second one run up. What I'll do here is that basically what we would do then is you would see normally I would then just go RDP to the server. It would be a normal Windows 2008 box. I would then configure IIS just as I would on any Windows server, and then I would then go in and be able to browse that website. Now, if we have a look at websites here as a contra, what we've got basically is, instead of creating the virtual machine, installing IIS, then putting, for example, WordPress on top of it, what we're going to do here is we're going to use the website service here. So what that means is Microsoft is going to look after all of the virtual server, the IIS, the patching, the management, all that sort of stuff. All we're going to do basically is we're going to install WordPress on this box, and then that's all we're responsible for. So in this case, I'm going to call it CBB blog. Oh, that's probably, let's do a dash. Okay, and then all I've got to do then is click a few more buttons and agree to the terms for the free database. And this will now go out and create a website for us. Now the difference here is with our virtual machines, once we run up our virtual machine, we're responsible for patching, for backing up, for doing all that sort of stuff. Microsoft will keep the host running, okay, and they patch the underlying host machine this runs on, but we're responsible for everything in the guests. Whereas if we use the website service, we're moving up the stack. So now we're only responsible for maintaining the WordPress software and also basically maintaining the data. So again, you're looking at infrastructure as a service versus platform as a service. So while that's spinning up, why don't I just show you the pricing? Okay, so what we can do here is if you go to azure.com, you'll see that there's a pricing calculator here. Okay, now if we scroll down a bit, you'll see the pricing calculator. So if we start, for example, on virtual machines, we click that option there. Okay, and we go, say we want a standard machine and we want it to be A series. I go down here and click an A3 and we want one of those A3 series. You'll see that it basically bills it per minute. Okay, so we can go down, for example, and then go in. We don't want the machine. Sorry, was that a question?
Yeah, I said, is that $342.87 above that per minute charge? Is that the per month charge?
That's the per month charge, that's correct. All right, so if we scroll down the bottom and we put it in a currency, hopefully you can understand, it's 267.84 of your cents per month, okay? And that's, again, an estimated price. Now, there is a spreadsheet that Microsoft provide partners which will allow you to go in and select all the options and work out the calculation using a spreadsheet. That's only available to partners. I can certainly show you that, and I assume there's a slightly different one in the US perhaps to what there is in Australia. So they're basically the two options. You either do it through the website or you use the spreadsheet calculator that Microsoft provide. So let me try and go...
Are the machine specs similar? For example, if I'm building a terminal server for a client with on-premise hardware, and I decide I need a 16 gigabyte machine with a terabyte of disk space, should I expect that the Azure machine should have equal specifications, or is Azure, you can build it smaller?
Well, I would think that what you would probably do is you could probably start with a machine with lower spec because it is very easy to upgrade, and being in a data center and also on blade machines, it would probably have better performance. But again, it's sort of a case that I don't know if you can really compare apples with apples. It's something that you probably have to, you would have to go in and basically try it out, and that's why having access to your Azure partner account is something that would be very, very, very handy. So that's going to give you that benefit. But it's, yeah, you can't necessarily compare direct costs of a an Azure machine versus a real life machine because there are some differences.
No, I'm not talking so much cost. I'm thinking I happen to be more familiar with VMware, and if I'm building a VM on VMware, I can allocate, for example, less memory on the VM than I would have to install on a physical machine. Because of the way that VMware uses memory, it can be more efficient. I'm wondering if something similar to that.
Well, I think, again, basically, yeah, it is basically very similar. I can't tell you the machine specs, and I'm pretty sure there are sites out there that will do the comparisons for you and let you know whether there are those sort of differences. Okay, so for some reason, let's try... No, all right, I can't remember what my password is. So anyway, you don't need to go in and see the IIS stuff. I can show you an RDP session. So that's the difference. Now, if we go into the websites, what we've got here is, this is my website here, and you'll see that it's basically up and running here. If I click on this link here, which is the live link, you'll see that it brings me to the configuration page for WordPress. So now, once it obviously spins up for the first time, you'll see that I now step through just doing the normal WordPress stuff. So I don't need to worry about IIS. I don't need to worry about all that information. I can get my website up and running quickly using whatever platform. Now, if I go into the website here, you'll see that I've got the option to monitor the machines, so I can see their loads. I can, again, the metrics here are also similar for virtual machines. I can go in and add my own metrics, so I can go in and select the additional options that I do want to see. What I can do, for example, is in Configure, you'll see that in the website side of it, I can now choose what .NET framework, what PHP version, what Java version I'm using, again, just by selecting a button. I can add my own certificates, my own domain names, SSL bindings, all those sort of stuff. Nice and easy. One of the big advantages here is when it comes to scale, this is a website. So at the moment I've got a free website plan. That means it's basically not costing me anything. I can have up to 20 of those. Now if I go, for example, to basic or standard, I need to save that, and that will then reconfigure the website quickly for me and give me more options. So the option with the standard tier, for example, will allow me, if I go down the bottom here, what you'll see is I can now scale depending on the CPU load. So if I now go in here and set up scheduled times, what I can say is I want a different scale for day and night, and I want a different scale for weekends and weekdays. Okay, so if I save that, what you'll see is now during a weekday, when the CPU reaches 80%, this bottom bar, what will happen is another instance will be added. So I'll have 2 web instances running. When the average of those 2 web instances exceeds 80% again on a weekday, then I'll add a 3rd instance. When the average demand drops below 60, one of those instances will be removed, and obviously my costing will be adjusted. Now, if I go and look at, for example, a weekend, you'll see that, again, the things can be different. So I can go in here and say, you know what, I want to scale this down, I want to scale that down, so that on a weekend, when the CPU gets to 68%, then it will add another instance. So this is the real power of something like Azure. You can easily and quickly scale it. Now, in the case of a virtual machine, what I can do is if I go in and look at my virtual machine, again, you'll see the same option here for monitoring. So I can go in and I can monitor like my performance counter as I did before, and we can add additional metrics if we so choose. Okay, that's easy to do. But in here, and again, I can add my endpoint. So at the moment, I've only got remote PowerShell and remote desktop, RDP, to this box open. I can obviously go in here and I can add the protocol like I did before when I set it up. And you'll see that I can also manage the ACL. So what I can do is I can say the ACL for PowerShell is restricted only to this IP address. So if you want to have it secured so it only is RDP accessible by your IP address, you can set that up using the Manage ACLs. But down here, for example, in Configure, you'll see what I've got is the virtual machine size. Now, to do an upgrade, all I need to do is pull this down and upgrade from an A3 to an A4, and then basically save it. It will obviously reboot the virtual machine, but that's it. The upgrade will be complete. That's all that it requires to upgrade the virtual machine to a more powerful version of the hardware. So that's really all that's involved there. So are they...
Is downgrade instances?
Yes, you can downgrade instances. Yep, you can select any of those options that are available to you in the Configure tab. So if you want to downgrade it, yes, you can do that. Any questions on that? No? All right, so let me just swap back to the slides quickly. Okay.
While you're doing that, one of the questions. Is there a method of importing a VM that's on-premise today?
Yep, there are certain restrictions around the sort of VM, the sort of disk, obviously the machine type that's based on, but yes, you can upload a VHD file into Azure and use that as a base, provided it obviously can be supported on the Azure platform. So you couldn't, for example, take an image of a 2003 server, upload that to Azure and expect it to run. That's not supported.
But if you've got a 2008 server running, 2012, that can be imported.
Correct. The other thing to remember about Azure is that you pay for data egress. So you don't pay for any data going into Azure, you pay for data coming out. So anything that you back up into Azure is no cost. Any virtual machine you upload to Azure is no cost. But if you were to pull down data, if you pull down a virtual machine, there would be a cost.
That's on a per gigabyte transfer basis.
Correct. That's on a per gigabyte, and it's a lot to do with the region, and it also has to, and that price is cheap. It's like 25 cents a gig or something, or 2 cents a gig. Or it's not very expensive at all, and that price, again, is decreasing.
So if users are using it, let's just assume that you put up a file server and a terminal server, an RDS server, and users are accessing data within those two. There's no data coming out, so there'd be no cost for that. But if you put it up a remote app server,
so
or a file server that they're accessing files from, then you actually have that cost happening.
So what you'd be seeing is you'd obviously have a site. You'd have a site-to-site. You know, any RDP traffic obviously would just be screen I/O, so you would be paying for some out. But yeah, if you have all your servers in the cloud and they access them server to server, yeah, the data stays within the data center. Typically, what we see is clients set up the servers in the cloud, and then they use something like a site-to-site VPN. So again, at the end of the day, yes, if the data stays within the data center, there's no cost for transfer.
But with site-to-site VPN transferring data to an on-premise device, then you would see some cost.
Correct. There would be egress. Any data out of Azure is billed, but at a very minor cost. Okay, so the way that Microsoft is currently selling, trying to get partners to sell Azure is via 3 options. Now, most of you probably don't qualify on EAs, but there is an option for that. Most of them are looking, this is typically what most people do, is a pay-as-you-go scheme. Okay, so you basically, when you sign up to Azure, you put in your credit card, and it bills you on the usage. Okay. Now, the other way that Microsoft is recommending you go for partners is to use open licensing. So what you do basically is you go and buy a number of different credits from, you buy $100 worth of Azure credits, so you get a $100 token. You buy that under open, and then you apply that against a customer's tenant or whatever to give them $100 worth of credit. Now, I don't think that's necessarily the best model. I think that you've got to realize that Azure's coming from a developer background, which means that typically it's used by developers to spin up in dev environments and then shut them down. I think we will eventually see the a flat per month cost. Remote app, for example, has just gone general availability, and that is moved to a per month base cost. So I think eventually we will see Azure move from so many credits and we run it down to a flat monthly usage. But at this point in time, you need to buy Azure credits. You can buy those via open. It's important to remember that if the Azure service runs out of credit, the Azure services stop. So if you have a machine that's running on Friday night at 5:05 and it runs out of credit, that machine will stop until new credits are entered into the system.
But no data would be lost.
No, correct. But the services would stop. So if you have a customer who has an e-commerce website on, selling on Christmas, and they haven't paid up or their credit card is invalidated, the Azure service will stop until valid credit is involved. So the recommendation generally is that you as a partner should look, and if you're selling Azure, is to look and go and buy some emergency credits, $100 credits, and then use them in case of emergency. My personal advice would be it would make sense to ensure that you charge a bit extra for those if they needed to be used in an emergency situation.
Are there alerts that can be set up when you hit the threshold?
Yep. The thing is, yeah, Azure will alert you, your customer, everybody who you set up, in there as an administrator will receive alerts. But we all know that clients don't necessarily pay attention to every email they receive. Okay.
Well, in terms of security, in a single spin-off of a web server or a regular server, it looks like the only firewall is the firewall on the server, right? There's no perimeter firewall, so to speak, right? Unless you set up a LAN with multiple servers, right?
Azure has its own firewall and its own security and its own, network. So again, if you want to run up an SQL server, SQL service, you need to basically allow those ports through the Azure firewall.
No, but who controls that edge firewall?
That the edge firewall is by default is by Azure, but if you want to run another firewall inside your virtual network, you can certainly set that up as an appliance if you want to do that. So Azure's maintaining the firewall at the boundary, monitoring for traffic and controlling that, but you have no say over that initial firewall into Azure. But if you want to set up your own device or your own firewall within your virtual network within Azure, you can certainly do that.
Is that a service provisioning from Azure?
Sorry, I couldn't hear that.
Is that a service that's provisioned with Azure?
There's no there is firewall devices in the virtual machines that you can select. So one of them at the moment there is Barracuda. So there's a standard Barracuda image that you can run up as a virtual machine and use as a firewall appliance.
But the Azure firewall that you're talking about that we don't control, we don't pay for, right? That's just a part of the
Correct. That's part of like Office 365 spam filtering. It's included as part of the service.
So the other thing that I talk about in the general world that about the RDP, the 3389 port that we should avoid. I usually recommend to go to a gateway with 443 XL. Is there any provisioning in the Azure that you can change that, or 3389 is only RDP?
So can you just repeat the question closer to the mic?
Okay. In general security, people recommend people not to use port 3389 for RDP because of the innate built-in insecurity, so to speak, of the RDP protocol. And recommend people usually go to a gateway and do like a port 443 type of thing.
Yeah. So if you have a look here at the end, endpoints, right? At the moment, it's mapping the remote desktop. It's actually coming in from outside Azure on 59.320, and then it maps internally to 39.89. Now, if I can go in and I can edit that, and I can make it whatever I want. So I can control the public port and the private port on any of the services from outside Azure. Does that answer the question?
Yes.
Cool. Okay. So let me give you an example of the power of Azure. So if you haven't seen it, there's an application called Inemia. Basically, if you pull down the inside of your eyelid and take a photo, that photo is then sent up to Azure, uses machine learning to determine whether you have a lack of red blood cells, for example. That application was developed in 9 months by two Australian medical students who won the World Imagine Cup. So what we're seeing is that people who don't have the IT skills, the low-level IT skills, are able to use a product like Azure to be able to create and run services and create commercial applications. So again, this is the way it's moving. Azure's providing them that sort of platform. Now, The other thing we need to consider in all of this is the Internet of Things. Okay, so we've got this Internet of Things, these fitness devices, all of these being connected. All the data's got to go somewhere. So again, when you look at things like Azure and the competing Amazon and Google options, all of this data needs to go somewhere. All of this data needs to be analysed. All of this data needs to be provided, needs to be basically turned into value. There's no way that generally you'll be able to provide the computing power to achieve that on-premise. Okay, the Azure data centers with their machines and the power that they're bringing on board and the cost is going to make that so much easier for all businesses to achieve. The other point that I think is worth considering is virtual desktop. So I believe that we aren't far away from seeing Microsoft release a product that will give you a virtual desktop probably tied to Office 365. So rather than you having to run up an RDS service, they will give you a virtual desktop on which you can run your applications and you as an administrator can control from a back end. Amazon's already doing something along those lines. Costs are already at zero. OneDrive for Business, OneDrive Consumer have now reached zero cost, so effectively storage costs next to nothing. You'll see tighter integration. So what we're seeing now is we're seeing a lot of web-based providers are actually using the Azure AD to authenticate. So they're actually using the Azure AD as their authentication mechanism rather than using their own. The other thing which they've added is obviously Australian data centers. So you're already probably getting Azure credits, so if you're not using them, take advantage of them, sign up, have a play with it, run up virtual machines, see how it works. I think Azure is going to be such a huge part of being an IT pro. It's Microsoft's major focus, so if you want to align yourself with Microsoft, you need to be at least looking at Azure. The skills you have on-premise, the networking, the IP addresses, the subnet masks, the VPNs, all that sort of stuff, still applies in the cloud, and even more so because you need to understand what's going on with DNS, and people need that knowledge because they don't have that low-level stuff. So again, plenty of opportunity. It's going to give you greater access to things like WordPress websites. So if you wanted to, for example, become a web hoster and just do WordPress sites, you could use Azure to do that and simply sell that as a service. It allows you lots of other opportunities, I think, around IT. So, for example, you could, if you're into the mobile app development, if you're looking to do SQL, it gives you far more flexibility to do that without the huge run-up cost which you have had before. And the other point I'll point out is, again, as I mentioned, it's Microsoft's major focus at the moment. If you want to align yourself with Microsoft and achieve the benefits and get the recognition and basically take availability of the resources they're pushing out, you need to, again, you don't have to change overnight to doing all Azure, but you do need to incorporate it and understand what it is that you can speak the same language. And at the end of the day, the prices are only going to fall. Everything's getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. Every month, Azure announces major price reductions. So what I'll do quickly to finish off here is I will show you an example. So what I've got here is I have a virtual desktop running in Azure. So this is a Windows 8 machine that is spun up that I can do Office 365 demos. So what I've got basically is I log in to Office 365. This user has the software installed. I can go in and demo all my Office 365 stuff here. It gives me a clean environment that I can go to and show clients. It also means that I don't need to drag a machine along with me to a demo. It means that I can generally run this demo on any device. So it gives me the flexibility to run it on a PC, a Mac, or an iPad. Now, the other thing it's given me is the ability to integrate Yammer. So if you're not aware, Office 365 enterprise plans allow you to incorporate Yammer. Yammer is another big part of the Microsoft ecosystem that if you haven't got into, you really need to have a look at. There is a free version and there is also an enterprise version. The enterprise version is available through Office 365. So if you have a partner tenant, at the moment you probably have access to allow you to create your own Yammer network. Now the other thing, this is the thing that's linked to Azure. So what I've got here is if you go to myapps.microsoft.com, you end up at this, which basically the Azure portal. So this is a single sign-on web portal that your customers can use to go to rather than going to Office 365. Now, why would they do that? The benefit you'll see is not only do I get Office 365 applications, but I can also configure third-party applications. For example, I've configured GoToMeeting. So if I click on, imagine I'm a user, just a general user, I click on GoToMeeting, you'll see what it does, hopefully, is that when it runs, it will then put in the login and the password for GoToMeeting for that user and log me into that service. So from the Access panel, I haven't needed to know, I've logged in once to this panel, and then I've configured all these web apps for the client to use, and they just can access them via a single click. Now, the way that I do that is that I'm logged into the Office 365 Azure tenant. So I've logged in as a global administrator into Azure. Okay, and what we see here is if you go down to Active Directory, you'll see that I have basically my Office 365 user. So these are all my Office 365 users. Okay, so I can work with them, I can change their password, I can rename them, I can do anything I can do in Office 365. And then, now what the advantage is now is to create that single sign-on portal, I can go into this area here called Applications and click Add. I can add my own application that I'm developing, or I can add one from the gallery. And what you can see in here is there are currently over 2,400 web-based applications that I can add to this single sign-on portal. So I can, for example, add Dropbox for Business so that when a customer accesses their portal, they will see a Dropbox icon. When they click on that, that will then log in with their unique login and password. The power of it is that I'm able as an administrator to configure that and set that up for them using the free Azure tenant that comes with Office 365. Now, what we can also do...
Is that at myapps.office365.com?
No, myapps.microsoft.com. Now, what I've also got here with Azure is we've got this thing called a Cloud Discovery app. So basically what you do is you install this agent on the workstations, and it will monitor and report for you what web-based applications that the user is running and allow you to incorporate those and manage. And it gives you things like what's being used, how often it's being used for every user. So as we move to more and more web-based apps, this is a very good way to manage that. Now, the last thing I'll show you as we get towards time is the remote app. So the remote app is a service that is pushed out of Azure. It allows you to, for example, publish individual apps into this environment like the App V model. And again, if I run this, it'll take a minute to spin up because I haven't run this before. But what you will see, I'll have to sign in. What you will see is it will then basically launch and run Visio, in this case, in a new virtual instance and allow me to access Visio on my desktop, interact with it as I would normally with Visio if it was installed locally, and then when I close it down, it's gone. So it leaves no footprint on the device, and it allows me to run Visio, PowerShell, whatever, on any device, because effectively I'm just RDPing into a single session that is running that application. Now, the advantage with that is that so here's the Visio. I can do it exactly as I would normally, and again, I get exactly the same power or whatever as I would with if I'd installed Visio on the desktop. Now, when I close that down, basically what that will give me is there'll be no footprint left, and makes it much easier as an admin to push all this stuff out. So rather than running an RDP box, one of the options is to use this new remote app technology and let Microsoft handle all that low-level stuff, and you just publish apps into it. So that's the basic model that's, again, available through Azure. So if you go into the Azure portal, you go into the options on the left, you'll see that one of the options, if you've enabled it, is the remote app. So let me just show you on my tenant.
Does that change your licensing requirements at all, or you're just purchasing licenses for concurrent users?
You still need, they've just sent it, they've made it to go GA, so it's just gone general release. So what you do is you buy the service and then you publish apps into it. But you can create your own apps and publish them into this service. So again, worthwhile having a look at. Most of this stuff you will get in Azure, you will get at least a 30-day trial. So either use your partner tenant or sign up for a free 30-day trial with Azure and just have a play. There's nothing to be lost here. You'll find that especially in the virtual machine space, there's a huge amount of stuff which is very familiar to you. Again, so my advice is certainly get into the virtual machines, create your own virtual environments. You can go down here and you can create your own networks, and you can have multiple networks. They can have different subnets, as you can see, different locations, and you can start networking together. If you want to get into the deeper aspects of it, you can look at something like machine learning. Also, Azure supports what's known as automation, so it has something called runbooks, which allow you to basically upload PowerShell scripts and automate those. So what you could do, for example, is if the customer doesn't require the RDS box to be running on a weekend, you can schedule that via automation and PowerShell to shut that down. And the good thing with that is it's going to save the customer money and give you more flexibility. So at the end of the day, your customers may not need it, but it's certainly going to provide them more flexibility. So there's some links which I'll send through. I think I probably need to start rounding it up. Are there any questions or queries? If you have any more, feel free to email me or email Michael, and he'll get in contact with me and give you some more specific information.
Robert, thank you very much. Very helpful.
All right, so what I'll do is I'll just stop the recording.